All right, welcome. It's so great to see so many people. At some point, Google Sally Field, you really like me, and you'll know how we feel right now. Up until then, you'll be like, what's wrong with this guy? I have no idea what he's talking about. So welcome to the Creative Writing BFA reading series, Imagine Wednesdays. Thanks for coming to our TA reading. If you haven't already, feel free to grab some snacks and some beverages. And don't forget to sign in so we can get a head count for all you who have shown up. So you're going to hear readings from TAs, obviously. Everyone who's in teaching your classes. And so what you're about to hear are works in progress. This is exciting for me because I believe I've heard each one of these, most of these pieces, and I've got to see them evolve. So, hopefully it might be a little inspiring and something you can take from this. These are different pieces than when we first saw them or started working on them. When all these become New York Times bestsellers, they'll probably be different than how they are today. Writing is a process. That's how we talk about writing. Process. All right, so our first reader is Cassidy. Cassidy is a fiction writer, poet, horror fan, and lapsed stand-up comic. Their work has been published around the web and is forthcoming in Nightmare Magazine. So, Cassidy.
Thank you. I'm going to kick this off with a series of short pieces. So this first one is Things You Will Not Confiscate. After the teachers took away their Yu-Gi-Oh cards and silly bands, confiscated the interchangeable parts of their names, and sewed solid, irreplaceable serial numbers into the backs of their necks, the students began trading eyeballs. Student number 4606 owned a little book of magic tricks where she learned how to pull new eyeballs out from behind other kids' ears. Number 5329 watched a YouTube tutorial for something called hardcore blinking and learned how to open more eyes than the two he was born with. The kids ran out into the woods at recess and traded techniques. They traded their eyeballs for eyeballs in different colors and sizes, and then different color spectra and depth perceptions. Eyeballs in different places, the backs of their heads or the palms of their hands. The supply was inexhaustible, and the demand for new eyeballs shrank when enough kids had enough eyes. They started trading eyeballs solely for who they belonged to, what pasts and neighborhoods they would see when they stared right into the pupils. They traded eyes they were still using. Student number 9280, who lived in the big house that used to belong to the mayor, took home bags full of her peers' eyeballs, placed them behind paperweights and on shelves, in between dishes and in shoes nobody wore anymore. Eyeballs started appearing around the school, near doors the students weren't allowed to open and at angles they weren't allowed to look from. Students triple-checked before moving their seats and sitting down. The eyeballs they could find would meet their gazes and blink at them somehow, without lids, while their intrepid discoverers picked them up and hid them somewhere better. The teachers caught on eventually. They always knew more than they let on, and they were proud. Genies. I hide in my house now, looking through the blinds from the upstairs window where I can see genies on the street corners. There are all the stop signs where in the past you could only see crying kids, back in the day when urban legend held that if you left brake stopped and launched yourself off your bike at one very particular sign, it would hold you in the air, just hold you, and for an hour you might feel like you were flying, if not moving. And every kid tried every sign, and the blood of our hands and knees stained the grass. But now there are genies. Red grass is covered up by the blue-green smoke that convulses below them. And kids can wish for air and for flying. And here, in my house, I can't wish for anything. This one's called Lungs Paper Plastic. Plastic bags may come with warning labels urging you to keep them away from children. It's unclear why they single out children when plastic bags could kill anybody. Deb says the labels come from a time before plastic bags took to the skies to hunt for unsuspecting pedestrians. But Alice says that makes no sense. Alice says, weren't plastic bags already dangerous before that? And Deb tells her to shut up. This is a fight they have to distract themselves from the other one. Alice needs to eat and needs to go to work. Deb, either some kind of vampire or else just very disciplined, does not. Both of them wish Alice could stay home, but the laser tag arena never closed down. It survived all the plastic bags in the world coming to life and preying on humankind. It would probably never die. When Alice took the job, she was a 14-year-old who loved leftover pizza dinners after a closing shift and smile yelling instructions at birthday kids. Now she's 25 and there's no escape. The walk from her apartment to the laser tag arena is a part of her body. She weighs down plastic garbage bags with bricks and staples their gaping mouths to the edges of the cans, and still they growl to escape. The company that makes them now makes them flammable in case they get out of control. And Alice carries a little lighter and a pocket gas mask. The birthday kids come in smaller groups these days. They cry more, and they're afraid of the emergency exits. Most of them, and most of their parents, wear paper bags over their heads with little holes cut out for the eyes, because they say that makes you invisible to the plastic bags in the air, but it also makes cars invisible to you when you cross the street. And Alice can tell more people are driving drunk these days. Some of the kids never take their paper bags off. But before that happens, every day Alice has to leave for work. She kisses Deb goodbye, and Deb insists that Alice take her bubble umbrella, the one with the tassels, from when she dressed as a jellyfish for Halloween. It won't make her invisible, but it's hard for the plastic bags to get through. If they try to get through the tassels, she can twirl the umbrella around and bat them away, and if they go any lower, she can step on them. And Alice appreciates the thought, but she doesn't want it. She wants to look up and see all the bags in the sky, handles outstretched like teeth, swollen with air that howls in their bodies like it's about to burst them open. This is the world she lives in now. This is the sky she walks under. And if a plastic bag one day swoops down onto her head, clamps down until she stops breathing and manages to resist all her attempts to claw it off, then that's just how she'll go. And this final piece is called Ant Twin. This one's coming out in Nightmare Magazine in November. Ant Twin. There are as many ants on Earth as people by weight, which means logically that every person on the planet has an ant twin made up of millions of specific ants who would all, if they could just get together in one place, weigh the same amount as each and every one of us. I'm building a glass case for my ant twin, me-shaped but smaller, because a mass of crawling ants would be denser than my body with all its air pockets and water and fat. The human body is almost 50% excess space, and we're weaker for it, unable to lift even 2 or 3 times our own weight. My human body disgusts me, but I will outgrow it when I see my ant twin, when I've gotten it all into one place, when I've put all the ants together into my own shape, when I watch my ant twin rise up out of the case, stretching its crawling limbs, learning to speak with my mouth, blinking its eyes at me until they become mine. I will remain silent while my ant twin finds its feet on my floor, plants them, walks up the stairs out of my basement, and leaves without saying goodbye, never asking me to follow it out of my house because it knows that I never will. I do not belong in its world. All right, thank you. Our next reader is going to be Allison. Allison is a third-year MFA student who specializes in genre fiction and young adult literature. Her favorite genres to write in are science fiction and fantasy because of the endless possibilities that can be worked into their worlds. When she isn't writing her thesis or teaching, she ignores her responsibilities by going to Target and listening to her favorite podcast, Let's Get Haunted. Everybody give a warm welcome to Allison.
Am I close enough to the microphone? Okay. I'm going to be reading from my thesis. It has no title, and I am continuously fighting with that it has no title. So let's get into it. Chapter 1, Sylvester. Cascadia only came alive after the rain stopped. Against a glistening backdrop of neon-lit skyscrapers, Mercer Marketeers rushed to set up shop along the footbridge that spanned the circuit between Carson and Regis Avenue. Guards took their positions between stalls. Awnings and umbrellas lined either side, and the narrow catwalk was absolutely mobbed with people enticed by a break in the weather and the smell of cheap, hot food. I kept my hood up and followed behind Roy, who shouldered through throngs of bodies too busy haggling and making illicit trades to move out of his way. He created a wake that my tall, lanky body easily slipped into. The recent storm marked the start of what I called skinning season, the time of year when the winds from the west brought rain almost constantly. Any break from the downpours was a welcomed miracle. Markets kept people alive in Cascadia, and Mercers like Roy and me protect them. We were the ones who made sure the marketeers felt safe and that people got fed and fought off the thieves and the market crashers. But Roy and I weren't on guard duty. Mac Cagney had a new front set up right on the other side of the circuit, and we were keen on foxing out the farm that supplied it. Our contact on the inside had gone silent, probably dead. Down on the circuit, self-driving vans merged without regard for street bikes or their drivers. The blaring horns and skidding tires added more chaotic sounds to the already frenzied market. I squeezed by the cart selling sautéed vegetables, air heavy with fry oil and onions. Next door was Lady, the mender, who attracted frantic swarms of people after every storm. She was shouting over both her customers and the broadcast of Vox Citadel blaring from her radio. I'd asked her once why she listened to that Emperor crap, and she said it made her laugh how wrong they were about everything. Upcycled shirts and handmade ponchos hung from the rungs of her tent. Someone tried to grab a clear raincoat off its hanger, and Lady smacked their hand with a roll of vinyl. That costs 1.0 ciphers. Can you afford? Then look, but don't touch. 1.0 ciphers was a hefty price tag, even for wares as in demand as Lady's. But that raincoat was real, not something scavenged and sewn together. It was real manufactured protection from the rain. I considered myself lucky for the gear I had. I wore leather, a long jacket, some boots, gloves, all treated with weather protectant. Untreated leather's a second skin. Thicker, for sure, but given enough time, the acid will eat right through it. Plastics like that raincoat are the best. They're more resistant, but hard to come by unless you have the ciphers. Only the dead gave up their protection from the rain. Stop! Thief! Lady's cry rocked the market to a standstill. I saw someone in red take off with the raincoat towards Carson. Two Mercers sprang from where they were resting against the rusted chain link and went after them. I darted forward, but Roy caught the back of my arm. They'll get it back, he said. Right now, I need you to not look like a Mercer. Roy's grip was vice-tight. How he could stand there and do nothing was beyond me. It felt wrong down to the core of my bones. I pressed the button behind my ear with my free hand and zoomed in on the back of that red-hooded bastard's head until I felt the hardware in my eye sockets strain. Their thief crashed through the market, shoving people and food carts over to block the advancing Mercer guards. They reached Carson, and that was as far as I could track. I lost sight of them and their pursuers. Roy's hold loosened. Sorry, but I need your eyes tonight. I wrenched out of his grasp. Then maybe you should get your own. I never wanted these fucking eyes in the first place. They made me feel less than human. I'd take my real parts over bionics every day, but after the Skyport incident, bionics were my only option. I needed to see again to keep working for the Mercers. Roy nursed a cigarette butt between his lips. This was how he got them to last, by sucking on the last bits of nicotine. Keep walking, he said. I couldn't bring myself to look at Lady and fell in beside him. Roy always stank like a smoker's coat closet, even when he didn't light up. I was half convinced the staleness had sunk into his skin, and that's why he looked so gray all the time. I associated his smell with the color. The toppled carts were righted, and the pulse of the market swelled again. Cascadia's markets have a reputation for theft, and because of this, the marketeers are ruthless and the Mercers on guard are always armed. Marketeers can't dwell on their losses. It causes them to lose more merchandise. They gave their full trust to the Mercers when they came under our protection. We'll take care of her, Roy said. We always do. I took a heavy breath to calm myself. I know. I wasn't mad at Roy. The situation just sucked. It sucked for Lady, and it made me feel useless. A part of me hoped I'd see that thief on the other side of the circuit in Cagney's territory, and then I'd get some payback for Lady. All the thieves we'd recently caught had worked for Cagney. We didn't stop for the Red Hollow walk on the opposite side of the footbridge and crossed Regis. There were no cars coming anyway. In the Citadel's inner core, the buildings reached high into the cloud bank and overlapped each other. Their brutal facades were dark except for the billboards advertising brands those from the outer core could barely afford, and the halogen signs pointing their way to restaurants and lounges. Color from their glow slicked out across the pavement, blues, greens, and purples like oil streaks in the rain. There's still something left of the poet in me from back before I dropped writing. I can vibe with beauty when I see it. I just don't often do. Thank you. Our next reader is James. James is a second-year MFA student at Stony Brook, Southampton, specializing in writing fiction, horror, thriller, and all things generally spooky. You can usually find him watching indie horror films, playing guitar, or feeding stray cats.
Hey guys, trying to see where are my 202 kids. I see Carson, I see Angelina, I see Matt, I see Katerina. Hey, I see Akira. Great. All right, so this is a story I wrote back in the spring, and for a little bit of context, my uncle was in the Navy, and he was a submariner. He would be underwater for periods, I think, of like 6 months at a time. And he used to tell me a little bit about this stuff and how creepy it could be, and that's what kind of inspired this. So this is the first few pages of it for you. This is The Darkness Aboard Zulu 5. On board the nuclear-class submarine, it was always night. The yellow-tinted bulbs that lined every hallway and every room tried their best to trick you into forgetting that, but everybody knew. If the power failed at any time, we would be lost in total darkness. Sometimes when I find myself too deep in what could have happened, I'll pull up footage from the Kursk disaster. They say that 26 of the 118 men aboard didn't die instantly when it sank off the coast of Russia. They say that while it sat at the bottom of the Barents Sea, they waited for rescue. The air ran out before that could happen. I count myself lucky to have never joined them. If I told you the name of my vessel, I'd be locked away in some black site within a few hours of publishing this draft on social media. I can tell you that it was an Ohio-class submarine, but that's only because many of them exist. I can't tell you whether we were armed with nuclear warheads. There were over 130 of us on board for this particular mission, a typical amount for the Ohio class. I can tell you that our job usually involves sitting on the ocean floor, listening for underwater sonar or movement of other subs. Our call signs rotate regularly for security purposes, but I can't publish the one we sailed under during my last week in the United States Navy. For the sake of this story, let's call it Zulu 5. No call sign of that name exists. I've also changed the names of my crewmates for the inevitable moment that my superiors read this. Make no mistake, they'll find it and read it, no doubt. They'll know exactly what mission I'm referring to, but at least this way, they won't have an excuse to come find me, hopefully. The Norwegian Trench is the deepest part of the North Sea. It runs over 2,000 feet deep. I can't go into much detail when it comes to our purpose there. Let's chalk it up to spying, like I said before. Things had gone entirely to plan the first few days of resting on the seafloor. We'd gone into total radio silence and shifted to minimal power. No transmissions, no internet, no bright lights even. Passive sonar only. No pings from our vessel that would give away our position to the enemy. Just listening. Just those dim caged hallway lights and the usual sounds, the ones that your ears get used to hearing until they barely register. The low thrum of the nuclear reactor, the echoes of conversation against the metal walls. Every hour we'd upload an updated report of our observations. On the surface, the official summary of this mission is stellar. That's because the spying that we'd been assigned to do was, in fact, a complete success. In the first few days, we've been able to collect all the information we'd been tasked with, and then some. Things started to change on the fourth day. The first sign came from Mason, the nuclear engineer. He'd perform his usual checks of the reactor levels just after dinner time and noted to the officers on deck that the steam levels were up from their usual position. Could be instruments malfunctioning, he said. Could be the pressure from our low depth, he said. Emerson, third in command, agreed and suggested ramping up the checks to every 40 minutes instead of every hour. When you're inside a submarine, day and night don't exist. There are no windows, there are no portholes, contrary to what you might see in cartoons or movies. Even if there were, all you'd see would be pure darkness, inky black, even deeper than outer space. Day and night are something that you have to create for yourself. Subcrews usually do so by our regimented schedule of meals, quality checks, reports, and so on. The crews usually do so by, I lost my place. The night crew wakes up and begins duty around 2200. Although day and night were artificial and monogamous, I took some personal solace in being a day shifter, just knowing that I was sleeping beneath a dark sky, even though that sky was thousands of feet above the blackness of the trench. Knowing that I was sleeping during the real nighttime, even though it was late afternoon for my family back home. So many contradictions. and yet it was something solid to hang on to. I slept at night. I slept at night. I slept at night until I didn't. When I first heard the dripping, I didn't open my eyes. The sound of water drops hitting metal wasn't as uncommon as you'd think, but something was different. I didn't know what, but it was just different enough that something compelled me to open my eyes. The white metal of my bunk ceiling stared back at me and reflected the dull red light of the hallway. My navy wristwatch glowed faintly in the low light, and as I eased myself out of sleep, I saw that the watch hands read 2:40. I waited in the dark, listening. The shallow breath of my bunkmate against the walls, the hum of the reactor on the other side of the ship, and that dripping. After another moment, I realized why it was so strange. It was getting louder, closer to my room. I sat up on my elbows and watched the narrow doorway to the hall, bathed in that same yellow and red. And then, something else, between the drips. Something was being dragged across the metal floor. Drip, drag, drip, drag. Whatever it was, it sounded heavy. What kind of equipment could they be moving around this late at night, I wondered. I kept my eyes trained on the narrow doorway. The shadow that crossed the amber glow was tall and narrow, and when the echo of water drops pinged the dead air, it paused, dragging something behind it. Another moment, and it was gone, gliding past the open door frame and out of sight. It was followed by a mess of stringy pulp that scraped the iron floor. It looked like a tangled mess of cables. An airy groan drifted down the hallway, back into my room. I was frozen. My heart pounded in my ribcage. I was possessed with a kind of fear that I'd never felt before. It was the terror of complete, horrific unknowing. I'd like to think that I'd seen everything there was to see, but that thing in the hallway was beyond my comprehension, something that must have been a dream, must have been. I don't know where I summoned the courage, but I managed to push myself up from the bunk without making any sound. The floor was freezing cold against my feet, with that usual dampness that clung to your skin on contact. The low amber haze of the hallway spilled across the left side of my face as I stole a glance around the corner. I was too late to see the shadow figure again, but I saw those dark cables that it held in tow behind it. They dragged themselves over the floor and wound their way into a side room 4 doors down from mine, squirming like eels with minds of their own. One of the alien appendages wound its way up the wall, and the way it caught the light, I could make out bloated suction cups feeling their way across the metal surfaces. Another sigh breathed its way down the length of the corridors as the tentacles writhed out of view. I didn't hesitate a moment. I paced my way back to the bunk without a sound and shook my bunkmate awake. Evan's eyes popped open, and I immediately held a finger to my lips with the lowest shh I could make. My eyes widened as a look of total confusion played across his face, still partially obscured in the shadows of the room. I pointed to the doorway and silently mouthed the words to him, "There's something on board." And that's as far as I'm going to go. Thank you, guys. So Shannon is a second-year MFA student who lives, writes, and teaches on the North Fork. They specialize in speculative and historical fiction and live for complicated characters with moral compasses that don't point true north. Shannon, everybody.
Hey, everybody. So I'm going to be reading from my novel in progress today. It's called The Two Nights, and it also happens to be my thesis at the moment. Okay. A stray page floated down from the library stacks. The crimson slip of parchment landed face up on Jace's open history textbook, too perfect to be an accident. Words written in a neat, whimsical script cut off the middle of a paragraph on the Union's infantry tactics during the Civil War. The modified linear system was inherited. The order invites you to Acolyte Mixer, Mole Hall Ballroom, Friday, 7 to 9 p.m., business casual dress. Jace's heart skipped a beat and rushed into his throat. This was it, the invitation he had been waiting for, praying for. He had only transferred to Harkin University 3 weeks ago, but Jace had spent every day and at least part of each night molding himself into the ideal candidate for a collegiate secret society. He had volunteered at the Writing Center, signed up for the Pride and Feminist Alliances, even agreed to run the Harkin Hens Instagram account, chronicling the adventures of the campus guinea hens. Just to show that he was interested, Jace had asked around about the order, but he never let on that he knew more than the group's skeletal Wikipedia page offered to outsiders. He could have recited the entry as fluently as any hymn. The Order of the Two Knights was founded in 1839 by Olive Robinson and Virginie Laurens, members of Harkin University's first coeducational class, after they were denied membership in the college's male-dominated organizations. Though lesser known than other American secret societies, the Two Knights has produced powerful alumni and many conspiracy theories. 3 weeks of sticking to the script like his life depended on it, because it did. 3 weeks of lying and pretending not to know better. The ruse had paid off. With the invitation still clutched between his hands like a rosary, Jace looked up toward the balcony stacks, but there was no trace of whoever had thrown the paper. Closing hour was in 15 minutes, and the library was nearly deserted. Shouldn't he have heard footsteps approaching or retreating, seen someone climb down? Not that it mattered. He had the invitation. Later that night, Jace slid off his stiff dorm mattress, crept past the sleeping pile of muscle that was his roommate, and pushed out into the cool, late September air. The trek into Auburn was a good 30 minutes, but Jace didn't mind the walk. After dark, Harkin's campus was pastoral but far from dead. Last-minute crammers rushed to and from the glowing res halls. Classes of grad students gathered on the courtyard and on the lawns to discuss matters that were too important to be contained in a classroom. The campus botanical gardens, the second largest in New York State, whispered the calls of owls and crickets in the distance. At night, Jace could almost convince himself Harkin was a normal college. Almost. Like most college towns, Auburn was where all the real action happened after the campus had shuttered. Downtown boasted restaurants that stayed open 24/7 for its insatiable college students, a sports bar that often had a line wrapping around Main Street, even a cat cafe that hosted weekly trivia nights. Jace didn't care about any of Auburn's offerings, at least not tonight. He stepped over a pair of his classmates as they tumbled onto the sidewalk in front of him and turned down the slightly quieter front street. There, skulking in the shadow of an old boxcar-turned-diner, was his destination, a blue mailbox. Jace pulled the letter from his back pocket. His script on the front of the envelope was sloppy from years of disuse, but Father Carey had said cursive would make his handwriting harder to identify if their letters were ever intercepted. No return address in the corner, so either the letter would find its way to St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Chinatown, or it wouldn't. The note inside was just as uncomplicated. Invitation secured. We'll write again after the mixer. A meaningless message to all except its intended recipient. Jace dropped the envelope down the chute. Pride was a sin, and Jace tried not to fall victim to that vice as he retraced his steps back to the dorms. He was the first scout to get an invitation to the order in years. The fact that Jace had predecessors, other wayward young men who had found their way to the church for one reason or another, had never been a secret. But Father Carey had always been reluctant to talk about the boys before. What Jace knew he had pieced together himself from parish records. One recruit had been a straight-A student who never managed to attract the order's attention. Another, an all-star track athlete, had gone to the Acolyte mixer, but returned to Manhattan a week later a disoriented shell of himself. There were others, but they all fell into one of these two categories: failure or inexplicable memory loss. Jace wouldn't let himself be one of them. On Wednesday, he gave a presentation on diversity in the MCU to his ASL class. On Thursday, he joined a living wage rally for student workers. On Friday, he got to work on the one job that really mattered: infiltrating the order. Thank you. Thanks, guys. All right, so our last reader is also our host this afternoon, Scott McKenzie. Scott is a second-year MFA student who lives in Sound Beach with his wife, daughter, 2 dogs, 3 cats, and a Venus flytrap named Stephanie. When he is not raising a child, helping around the house, teaching, grading papers, working part-time in the Department of Student Engagement, going to class, and commuting to and from class, he stares blankly at a wall because he's so tired. On a rare occasion, he finds time to write. So here's Scott. Give it up for Scott, everybody.
Thank you. I'll be reading the opening from my novel, which I intend on being my thesis, titled The Iron Knight. Wake up, Sergeant. Malcolm Gray slurred awake. The same dream had laid siege on Malcolm. A woman with fiery blue eyes. She was falling. then a vast battlefield shrouded in a darkness that shifted and moved as if it were alive, then dragon's fire. Sergeant Gray, wake up. Malcolm opened his eyes. Oren knelt over him, looming as if imposing himself as a new character in Malcolm's recurring dream. But Malcolm was laying in the real dirt of his very real cell. One of Oren's eyes shone in the light of the single candle he held, the other in shadow. Oren was cowled in the brown robes of a common priest, not his usual embroidered white ones, and they seemed gray to Malcolm in the dim, flickering light. Jero Giggins, the jailer, snored in the corner. Have but a moment, Malcolm, Oren said. Guardsmen are coming for you by order of the master of the guard. Master Baldeg? The words scratched at Malcolm's sticky throat. Why? Malcolm hadn't slept well for quite some time. Not even in the deep trench of whiskey-addled sleep could he hide from his vicious dreams. Oh, Malcolm, Oren sighed. He set the candle in the tailings, artifacts still left strewn about from the temple's ancient construction. He raked his fingers in the dust and excavated a spall of granite. He wondered for a moment how this chip of rock, created by the gods and forged by the hand of Alban the Creator, had withstood the ages, only to be cut and hewn by some ancient mason in a time long before the word or station of Grisia was in the realm's vocabulary. How 1,000 years had nearly passed since this chip had been noticed and considered. How 1,000 years or more may pass until this chip might be held and considered once more by a man whose station was beyond Oren's ken. Like many men, Oren desired his name to be preserved and remembered. However, the words maketh the man, quoth the ancient texts, not the memory of him. Out of curiosity, Oren pressed his thumbnail into the pointed end of the spall, and it snapped. Disquieted, he marked how easily it did so. I shall call in the Pilgrim Guard, Oren thought, as he tossed the chip in the dust. Malcolm had fallen back asleep. Oren laid his hand on Malcolm's shoulder to rouse him again. Malcolm stirred. I cannot interfere, Sergeant Gray. This is a matter for the guard. But if you survive, find Captain Vela. He will bring you before the council as dictated by the code of the guard. I will be holding a council of brothers in conclave with a witan of envoys from the 4 kingdoms. If you are brought before me, I will do what I can. I must go. A darkness rises in the south. One word penetrated the fog in Malcolm's head. He grasped Oren's arm. Survive? Oren paused and smiled. He laid one hand on Malcolm's head. With the other, he grabbed Malcolm's hand, and in it he slipped a coin. May the gods prosper it with thee. Cut yourself. Forgive and pay the hangman. The memory of the dream rolled back in a flood, its tide threatening to drag Malcolm back into its world. He felt uneasy and tried to ignore his desire to consider its meaning. He ran his hands against the dirty stones beneath him to anchor himself in the waking world. It's don't cut yourself, Malcolm said. He coughed. Don't cut yourself, the clerk would say when handing guardsmen their wages. In the early days of the guard, men had been paid in goods and livestock. They would trade cut pieces of mutton or goat with pilgrims or travelers. Young guardsmen would not know the value of commodities throughout the realm, oftentimes trading good meat for worthless items, thereby cutting themselves a poor trade. Later, when they were paid in silver, the phrase would be a warning against spending wages frivolously. Is it indeed? Oren said with a smile. Ben be with you, Malcolm Gray. Ben be with you, Malcolm croaked. Oren covered his head and rose. The gate clanked and groaned behind him. He lifted the candle and turned away. The light seemed to float off like a spirit. Oren glided out of the cellar, leaving Malcolm again in the dark. As he slipped past Jero, Oren released him from his slumber. Malcolm tried to sit up, but became dizzy from the sudden movement. He put a hand out to stop the spinning. His stomach churned and he dropped to his elbows. He was still drunk. He shifted himself to lean against the wall, but the basalt floor on which the temple was built made for irregular walls and uneven and generally uncomfortable floors. In the cell again, he groaned and lay down. Thank you. All right. So the next 15 minutes are open to any questions you might have for any of the readers, any topics of discussion, anything you're curious about them as writers, anything about their pieces that jumped out to you. We'll just go to a show of hands if anyone has any questions. Don't be afraid to be the first person. I was told to wait. Thank you. Hey.
I heard the ant one before, ant story. What was it called?
Ant twin.
How true is that? The facts about the ants?
So this is a question for Cass. How true is the ant story?
So the just sort of trivia fact that all the weight of all the ants on Earth is equivalent to the weight of all the humans on Earth. That's something that you might hear around. I have no idea if it's true. It was just a fun fact to play with that way.
Any other questions? Hi. Do you want the mic?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have a question for Cassidy and the lady with the science fiction question, but first I'll go with Cassidy. May I ask, around what time period you wrote the short story about the plastic bags?
It's an interesting question. That was written November, December of 2020.
Oh, okay, because I was really interested by the parallels between the short story and I guess the COVID pandemic, because I've seen that, if I get COVID and I die, that's just the way I go kind of mentality. I had a feeling that it was, I guess, somewhat inspired by the pandemic.
So to respond to that, I will say, when I wrote the story, I wasn't necessarily setting out to write a pandemic story, but I did notice after I had written it, and since then it has become, I felt like the sort of parallels that people will see when they hear that one, it's become kind of a double-edged sword, because I have that section about people wearing paper bags over their heads, and I'm worried that people are going to think that that's supposed to be like a one-to-one analog of wearing a mask, and think that I'm, trying to make wearing a mask seem ridiculous by comparing it to that, and that was never the intention. So I worry about, sometimes you write something in a particular time period, and then the context as time keeps going changes what things mean.
Thank you. And may I ask for your name? I'm sorry, I forgot.
My name is Allison.
Oh, Allison, I really loved your work, and I was just wondering, is there any specific sci-fi author that you take inspiration from, or any work or movie?
Not necessarily. I want to say that the most ironic thing about this story is that I've never really watched or read anything cyberpunk in my life, and there are very many parallels down to line level. From Blade Runner. One of the things is that I named a character Roy, and I didn't know that the main villain of Blade Runner's name is Roy. So there's that. That's how clueless I was, but it just became cyberpunk because I wanted one of my main characters, Sylvester, to have night vision. I wanted that, and it just became cyberpunk because then that just opened the door for bionic enhancements. I'm sorry, can you say the rest what else did you ask?
No, that's it.
Oh. And yes, I will say I did recently read Ken Liu's short story collection, The Paper Menagerie, and Ken Liu, the story Good Hunting has been adapted into the show Love, Death, and Robots, which I was very interested to find out, and I do really love that collection of short stories, and it does have a very cyberpunk feel to many of those stories.
Thank you. I also love that Netflix series. It's really good. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it also brings up a really interesting point that as writers, we can't help but be influenced by the world around us sometimes, whether we know it or not. So, any other questions? I thought it was really interesting, Cass, about the plastic bags as well. You sort of zoomorphize them. I thought that was really interesting that, giving them teeth and howls And at first I was thinking like humans aren't oftentimes, I mean, you know, it's a liability thing why they say don't put this over your head, but like humans aren't suffocated yet. I think that's a great point that we do while you're going for it or not. And to extend, like, but there are species that do die because, you know, suffocate. And I don't know if that was even in your realm of consciousness while you were contemplating, you know, making monsters out of plastic bags. Did you have anything to share about that? Like what were you contemplating when you were inventing, creating this world?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear people are taking all of these things from it. The truth is the origin of that piece was just the prompt to open your piece with a statement that is just a statement of fact that you know, doesn't contain anything else in it. And I wrote down, you know, plastic bags may contain warning labels, and then everything from the relationship between the two main characters to this plastic bag apocalypse came out of that. You know, I'm glad that it feels applicable to so many other things. So I'm going to pretend that, yes, I 100% intended all of those readings.
I think that's the great thing about literature is the conversation doesn't stop once the piece is printed, you know, then you engage in the conversation and you can talk back to the writer, and then it's, I think I saw a hand going up. Yes, did you have a question or a comment?
Specifically about this discussion, sorry, I was messing with
Yeah, go for it. Just because I was saying that doesn't mean it's important.
Oh. I was just going to ask, for any of you who've made like larger pieces, how do you go about turning like an idea for a piece into like a full plot and then writing it?
That's a great question. Well, I know, like, I've seen Allison's piece evolve and I've seen Shannon's piece evolved, and I think those started from very different ideas than what we heard today. Maybe just talk about how you got there.
Okay, I guess I have the microphone, so I'll go first. Many people sitting in these chairs over here have seen various iterations of my thesis, where it began, where it was just, there was no cyberpunk elements, and then it became very cyberpunk. And the most ironic thing, I'm saying ironic again, the most ironic thing about this piece is that it is something that I have carried with me since 2016, and that version of the story was very, very, very different, and it was really just like a messy story about a bunch of people living in a city that was, like, again, you know, government sucks, so the government sucks, and the city had fallen to pieces, and there were a bunch of people vying for control, and the only thing I took from that original iteration were actually the characters, except for one, who is one of my main characters. She exists, and I'm glad she exists now because she is one of my favorite characters I've ever written. And that just goes to show how you're gonna have your writing and you're gonna take it and it's going to evolve over the years, because these two, you know, the evolution of this story is nothing. It's wild because it's nothing like what it originally was. And I had that original idea thanks to I was working on it with my cousin, and it's now 2022 and it's my thesis and it's a completely different story. And so my advice is just to keep writing and get people, you know, bringing your pieces, if you're in a workshop, to your workshops. Get your trusted feedback from your professors and your peers, and you will see your work evolve over time. Who wants to take this?
So I kind of have a similar story to Allison in that, like, when I came into the MFA program, like, this is what I wanted to write. I was like, I want to write an LGBT, like, speculative urban fantasy kind of thing where a guy infiltrates a secret society and just sort of, you know, set that up from the beginning. And so it didn't change that much from that beginning idea. But this first chapter, these first 2 pages are like, there's only a matter of like a few lines from the first draft of this. And what really changed that, though my idea stayed the same, was getting, sort of like Allison touched on, feedback from people. Like the thing that has proven to be like invaluable for me is having my audience of, trusted people who I can send this thing to. And they're going to be honest, but they're also going to be supportive. And that makes all the difference sometimes, is just having people to read your work for you and be like, this is not quite like, I'm not seeing this. And probably as writers, like what we put on the page we think is completely clear, but then when we share it with somebody, sometimes it's not. And just finding that out from our trusted group of readers is extremely valuable. People will say, like, for like longer works, outline is essential. I have never outlined, so I go chapter by chapter, and sort of that's how I work. But I think outlines also have their value if that's something that can help you contain your thoughts and ideas. So it's just a matter of experimenting and finding what works for you.
Sure. Yeah, I would say the same as Shannon, where everyone's going to be a little bit different, right, when it comes to a longer work and such. Not all ideas that you have are going to become really long works. I write a lot of short stories, so that's perfectly okay to have an idea, and you work on it a little bit, and you're like, yeah, this is something that's going to be maybe 12, 15 pages. That's totally okay. Not every idea is going to be a full novel, but like Shannon said, everyone is totally different with these things. I also don't outline when people ask me, oh, do you know how the mystery that you're writing is going to end yet? I'm like, no, I have no idea. I do one chapter at a time, and it kind of evolves on its own. And I try to tell my 202 kids, these guys can all confirm, I say, don't worry about the first draft. Write what feels right, and there will always be time to go back and change things around, and it probably will end up completely different than what you started with, and that's okay. So over time, it just kind of evolves, like everyone has said. So yeah, that's what I would tack on to that.
Yeah, revision. Any other questions? We probably got time for about one or two more, depending upon how in depth they are. Yeah, I guess if I may, I know I've been holding this mic a lot, but my story came out of me about 10 years ago. It was pretty much all in summary, and then I went back and like new ideas came to me. I read some Shakespeare. Oh, that's a great idea. Read something out of the Bible. Oh, that's a great idea. Saw a movie. Oh, that's a great idea. And start piecing things. I think isn't there a term like pantsers? You write by the seat of your pants. You have no plan. Sounds like a lot of us do. Some authors are great at outlining stuff, but yeah. Any other questions? Anybody want to tell their TA how awesome they were? Wow, you're mean. Oh yeah, Allison is awesome, according to her professor. All right, great. Well, I'll take your silence as indifference. No. Thank you. Oh, I had my closing notes somewhere. Anyway, thank you all for coming. There are signs about when the next one is. The same time next month. Again, make sure you have signed in so we can get a head count and all that. And we look forward to seeing you folks again. Thanks, everyone.